Professor you in receipt of this email, 4 combat fighting men should be at your private command. You ask them who they are. They shouldn't take any trouble. Now come, discover them. So ladies and gentlemen, welcome back. My name is Victor, the author of the Fire Soldier. Enlist under an alias, and usually the reasons were that most of these recruits were underage, that is number one, and they never wanted their families to know. And number two, apprentices without their master's permission and enrolled into the war. Number three, those who had served before but had been discharged for misconducts. And lastly, those, of course, who might have escaped from the arm of the law. Technically, it was an offense under the Armed Forces laws to give false answers on attestations, but it was not usual to prosecute for it. The aliases became the man's armed forces name, in quotes. And there was a provision in King's regulations as well on the procedure for a man to declare his real identity and have his enlistment papers annotated accordingly. Now, this tactic is not only deployed in government agencies, but also by organizations of terror, and of course the Shrine Tango movement, a faction seething with secret dealings and seemingly appearing to deploy intentional violence and fear to achieve ideological aims, is one that we have met from the beginning of this series. Talk of aliases created by this faction. Todd 64, for example, is one that is obviously given to Dr. John Taylor. And then we have the S-Man, or rather the Silent Man, given to Mr. Alfred Bench, as we shall come to learn later. Here, deployment of men under assumed identity, aliases that is standard procedure. So follow me closely in this series and you will capture the typical guise that the major characters assume. So ladies and gentlemen, allow me to proceed from where I left in the previous episode. This is episode number 23 of Survive. Todd 64, John Taylor. I struck the introduction string. Professor William turned, nodded. Buddy, he said, you got a name? The S-Man was the reply. "The S-man I see," said Professor Wilhelm, essaying away towards the window. "The silent man," Jake interjected, Alfred Bench by name. "You there," said the professor, turning to Jake. "I spoke to you on phone last week." He bit his short, dark upper lip an instant and raised his head to his spectacles, his little eyes surveying the black rims. He steadied the spectacles away to a new focus with a trembling forefinger and thumb. "Correct, sir," replied Jake Daniels. "And that one there is Dawson Miles." "So when do I meet the rest?" "With time, sir," I said, indulging in a prolonged vacant stare. "Let us not frighten you, sir," said Miles, his eyes settling on me for a moment as though his statement was meant for my consumption. With that reply, Professor Gutenberg pulled his chair closer to Mr. Daniels and said, "I wouldn't want to interrogate you, sir, but it appears I'm firmly persuaded, as if you haven't quite understood the objects to be settled by your small visit." He pulled back a pace. At that instant, Miss Effie Amanda stepped up to pour us more coffee. "You are not going, sir," she whispered to me, threading her way around in a lovely catwalk. "Are you?" "Certainly not, my dear, certainly," I quickly replied in an unfinished sentence. As to whom her heart had warmed, I leave you to conjure if you can. But if I should be allowed to impress, when her little fingers sneaked about Professor Wilhelm's hair, I knew she had just as many flaws as anyone would have had in matters of cupidity, money, and age. Amongst these anxious faces, though, there was the cocker spaniel seated beside the table. It eyed its master, waiting in a state of alertness intended as tribute to its abilities. What would it be like to shake Amanda's hand? How would it feel if I kissed those lips? And what pleasure would she derive from my having her? I could only imagine. The email went further. "No blowbacks. You will call the shots. One of the aforementioned 8 soldiers will directly submit to you. His name is John Taylor, designated as Todd 64 in the X-Files case. Since Officer Addison Cooper, who has been the STM security liaison officer as well, and who I'm afraid you will not have a chance to meet, died during the 3rd stage of the X-Files case, I should like to remark that John Taylor takes over this situation. Without hesitation, I will say in but a few preliminary words that John, as you might have already realized, should be nothing less than a perfect match to your genius, Mr. Professor." I smiled, quickly scanning across the gentlemen at the table for possible micro-expressions. The email goes on. "Now, here's the thing. Professor Dr. James Kitten, a Nobel laureate in the world of physics, to whom Professor Wilhelm is acquainted, has been working on this case for 3 years now. As a summer getaway," mumbled Wilhelm, "we used to ride scooters together in Ukraine. James was an extremely private person, a brilliant scientist who read the newspaper every day and thought science should be featured more by the media. I'll proceed." So the email goes on. "Addison Cooper allegedly having drowned, what followed was the mysterious disappearance of James Kitten. To this very moment I draft these disquieting lines, I confirm that we haven't recovered his remains. In fact, we suspect he might have decided to go under the radar. True to that fact, Mr. Stephen Blame is in receipt of a postcard by today's post from some guy calling himself Mr. Coughlin Gottschalk, informing that James Kitten is indeed alive and kicking. It greatly excites our curiosity that the objects of his actions must not be pursued by any member of the STM. Such grounds have been sought to have no lives lost or whistles blown. I'm indebted to Venture, though, that we know his decision to disappear despite our €5 million reward might have been instigated by the pressure at 935 Pennsylvania Avenue in Washington, D.C. He had been requested severally to present himself at 9:35 for interrogation, but declined to have a polygraph test. His last remarks, Professor Wilhelm, and I quote, "I'm deeply sorry indeed for not completing stage 3 of the X-Files chain. I venture to express my failure to cooperate as far as the Washington interrogations were concerned. It shall not be underscored, however, a waste of time, if my learned colleague, Professor Dr. Wilhelm Gutenberg of Humboldt University, feels alarmed by this correspondence. Say, if you please, that my recommendation as far as this unfortunate transition is concerned now lies upon his brains. Excuses our application for your brain in this case." The email finally comes to an end. This was one of those October days when the wind blew strong and cold. I sat there, all ears to the professor, staggered by the objects of that email.
So, ladies and gentlemen, the email received by Professor Wilhelm Gutenberg from the STM's boss, Mr. Howard Green, concludes my today's episode. Stay tuned.